Hi, everybody. Come on in. We're ready to get started. Welcome. I'm Tim Richards. I'm the SVP of Sales at AOL Advertising. We are very happy to be part of this wonderful event, and this is our third year being involved, and really happy to see it grow to the extent it has. So I have the pleasure of serving on the advisory board with Kathy Mabey, who I've known for a long time, Brian and the team, and they gave me this great assignment of introducing Jeff and Callie. So our next speakers are Jeff Lanctot and Callie Schweitzer. Jeff is the CEO of Mixpo. Allie oversees the digital transformation of Time, one of the most important publishing brands in the world. A little bit about both of them. Jeff is a familiar face to many of you here in Seattle. Very distinguished career here, most recently as the Chief Digital Officer at Razorfish. Also had great runs at Microsoft Advertising, and now serves as the CEO of Mixpo, which is a very strong emerging brand coming out of Seattle as well. Callie, again, comes from Time, but she was essentially discovered when she appeared on one of the most influential tweet lists and garnered a huge following in social media and was hired by Time Digital to transform that brand. I've known Jeff for a long time, but I hadn't met Callie before today, so I wanted to look up some of her tweets to get a better sense of what she was all about. And one caught my eye was recently she wrote, "Today in things that are real, Britney Spears songs are now being used to scare away Somali pirates." So I thought that was a very good sense of what she's all about, and again, why she's so widely followed. But again, Callie's appeared on numerous 30 under 30 lists, most recently Forbes. Jeff is a Hall of Famer. He has been named on Media Magazine's 50 most influential people in digital media multiple times. So very happy to welcome Callie and Jeff on stage. Thank you.
Here we go.
The funny thing about doing these things is that I always feel like it's like having lunch in front of an audience. We're getting to know each other too.
I'm just still trying to figure out what Hall of Fame I'm in. That was high praise from Tim.
Just take it.
Yeah, I'll take it.
Credit.
Yeah.
So I guess I wanted to start out our conversation by seeing what you're most excited about in the digital media advertising and publishing world.
Well, I started as CEO of Mixpo 1 week ago.
Brand new.
Yeah, and I actually had my first board meeting today. So
what's going to happen? Can you give us any inside scoop?
I have no idea. I just hope it's a friendly room. But you know, I before I accepted the job, it was a good chance for me to think about what I wanted to do next and where I thought things were heading. And the thing that I liked about Mixpo was it feels like we're finally at a point where multi-screen advertising is ready for prime time. I like to think of multi-screen or cross-device versus mobile, because as important as mobile is, I think there's a lot of different ways that people are using devices, and so that's what I liked about Mixpo. The other thing is that it still feels very early in social, and we have a very strong social business for video advertising. And I saw there was a Forrester reporter or analyst, Nate Elliott, who yesterday talked about Facebook as essentially called it a failure in the ad business. And I see the revenue they make, so I think failure's a little strong. But I think his perspective was good in that it shows that things are so very early, so there's room for a lot of new companies to emerge. So whether it's that the multi-screen, whether it's social, I think we're just at the beginning of a new phase of technology companies. And then the third thing I would say is we are, I think, at the early stages of a new sort of a new era of quality content. There was a lot of content that sort of sprung up in a fairly short amount of time in digital. And I think we're just now at the point where the best content is starting to be recognized, and certainly time included there. And so I think it's going to be really interesting to see kind of a rebirth of great content. So that's probably the third thing that I'm looking forward to.
I have to agree with this idea of quality rising to the top. I'm obsessed with this idea of navigation paths for news and how people discover what they read. So I wrote a post for Medium, which is Ev Williams, who founded Twitter. He created a blogging platform that has now newly been open to everyone, so everyone can join and write there. But I did this sort of experiment where I tracked everything that I read all day. And I am a voracious news consumer. I read all day, every day. I recently discovered that there was a time in my day in which I was not being productive by listening to music, and so I switched to podcasts instead, which is, you know what that says about me. But
I will say as an aside, I think podcasts are one of the most underrated marketing platforms.
I totally agree, and I recently saw that Bob Pittman said radio is about to have its heyday again, and I totally agree.
Yeah.
But I am really obsessed with this idea of navigation paths for news. So I've always been driven by this idea of news you don't know you need, and how do you spread quality news? How do you bring news to people who don't know that they need it? I have this term that I call audience hacking, which I think is something that I've really focused on in my career, and that's finding new audiences for stories that you didn't know needed those audiences, or those audiences didn't know your content existed. And I think that is really the future of news and of publishing, is figuring out how to get your content to the people who don't know that they need it. That comes in so many different forms. I mean, that's social media packaging, that's email newsletters, that's Flipboard, Pulse, all these different aggregators. But I'm just so fascinated. I mean, if in a dream world, and maybe time will let me do this at some point, but I would just travel around the world and ask people, how do you get your news? I mean, every time I meet someone new, I say to them, how do you get your news? What do you do next? What happens there? Because I'm so fascinated by this idea of incoming versus outgoing. You know, I think a lot of people in this room are probably seekers of news, but most people in the world are not seekers of news. They let news come to them. And so if we at Time and across all of media are going to be bringing people news, how do we find them? And I think that is a paramount question right now.
Yeah. Tim, mentioned Twitter, and one of the things that I like following most is different journalists who share where their inbound traffic is coming from, whether it's Google or Facebook or Twitter, and the way that that's shifting over time is, I think, is just fascinating. I grew up in a newspaper family, and so journalism and content has always been important to me in the sense that it was sort of a dining room diploma in journalism. But it's been really interesting to see how the patterns of consumption have shifted over time.
I'm also really interested in the idea that in print, you have so much more real estate to sell a story. So how does that translate to digital? I still read the New York Times in print every morning before work. I subscribe to 14 magazines, 6 of which I read every week. I said voracious consumer of news. I really meant it. But I'm so fascinated by the idea that when you read in print, you read things you wouldn't have normally read online. And that's because there's so much more room for the story to be sold to you. There's a headline, there's the placement on the page, there is the photo that's attached to it. Online, everything is essentially equal on Twitter, where everyone has 140 characters.
Yeah.
And I think that this idea of how does that translate in digital is so interesting. And that's definitely true for brands and advertising as well. Red Bull is creating its own content. It has the same amount of space as publishers do on the internet.
Yep. Yeah, and I think that's where print publications, newspapers specifically, have struggled the most, is that their position as the authority of what's important in news has been diminished to some degree because readers or viewers are they're deciding who that authority is, and newspapers used to be the default. What was on the front page was what was important, and that's not so much the case anymore.
I had a young woman come into my office the other day and she said, "I'm so concerned. All my friends get all their news on Tumblr." And I said, "That's great. We have to post to Tumblr more."
Yeah.
It's so interesting to see where different people are going for their news, because it's absolutely right. You don't have the New York Times on everyone's doorstep anymore telling them this is the story you need to know. And yet, what we still see is week after week, Time magazine makes news with its covers. It owns a news cycle. I mean, people talk about our covers. And so I think that the death of print has been greatly over-exaggerated. I mean, I still know plenty of people who read in print, and print news still makes news.
Yeah. Though I think magazines probably are in a bit better position because they, by design, mark sort of a moment in time. It's not about breaking news. I think when you're in the business of print breaking news, in the case of a daily newspaper, it's hard to not feel a little bit stale when people are getting their news in real time from Twitter or Tumblr or Facebook or whoever it might be. Magazines typically aren't expected to break news, do more in-depth reporting, but aren't trying to compete in real time.
I've always felt like online news is a habit, whereas getting a magazine in the mail is an experience. It's something that I relish, and when it comes, I'm flipping through the pages, and it's something that I feel is so tactile and something that I get to take action about. And I love that. I'll always love that experience. Maybe I'll be the only person left on earth still reading magazines, but I love it.
Yeah, it's still, magazines are still a validating medium for brands. If you are, in Time or Esquire or GQ, there's a validation of your brand that I think is still hard to replicate online. You mentioned Time covers, and I've certainly noticed it feels like more recently the attention that those covers get. Has that been a specific plan that Time has undertaken?
I think Time covers have always received tons of attention. I mean, Google versus Death, Prince Charles.
Yeah.
These are things that make global conversation happen. It's possible that in the digital age and the digital world, they can get even more attention. I think it's probably
it feels like they're being shared a lot more.
Certainly.
Yeah.
And I think, cover art is something we always pay a ton of attention to, and we always have incredible photography on our covers. So I think maybe that's part of the visual revolution of journalism, is that sharing of those images.
Yep. And how do you think about trying to replicate that relevancy of the covers in digital?
It's a really good question. I think that we're always thinking for multi-platform experiences, whether that platform is print or whether that platform is Twitter or whether that platform is tablet or time.com. So I think we always try and make the best experience on every platform. For us, the print magazine, it's obviously an experience, but online, something different works. I think about J. Newton Small's piece on the sisterhood of the women in the Senate and how women are the only adults left in the Senate and in Congress. And in print, that was a fantastic story to read, to just see the photos. And online, she did a piece, in addition to the piece being online, she did a piece, 10 Things I Didn't Know About the Women in the Senate Until I Wrote This Piece. Talked about her 10-month-long reporting experience and what she learned going along with everyone. And I think that's something that it just worked online in a very different way than it would have in print. And I think that that's just sort of a perfect example of how those things can cross platforms.
Yep, makes sense.
So what's most exciting to you in the advertising space right now?
I think that if you look back over the last, call it 15 years or so, there's been a few different moments when there was an opportunity for new technologies in advertising to come to bear. first in the late 90s with just third-party ad serving with DoubleClick and eventually Atlas. I think the second wave was around mobile, and now we're at a point where, as I mentioned before, there's new entrants in the multi-screen technology front, and that's what I've always enjoyed the most about this industry is when there are a lot of new technologies and new companies that are battling it out to sort of become part of that next wave of successful technologies in our industry. And it feels like we're at that point again. And that's, frankly, it's why I joined Mixpo. And the video ad platform is, clients love it. And so we, I think we've got a good fighting chance to be one of those companies.
I'm really excited about wearable technologies and sort of where the Google Glass and the Jawbones and the Pebble watches take us. I remember a few years ago reading about, I think it was out of the New York Times R&D lab or something, where they were doing a kitchen table or a mirror that had your news coming to you. And I know at CNN's bathrooms, they have like TVs. I mean, a lot of hotels now too have TVs in the mirrors, and I just think that's so exciting, and yet it's becoming a reality. It's something that, we're living like the Jetsons now.
Yeah.
I wonder what that's going to look like. Do you have any predictions or anything that you think we may see soon?
The only prediction I have is that any of the wearable technologies that we see today will not be around in 5 years.
They'll be implanted on our heads already, or
well,
something?
I'm not sure what it would. I'm not sure what it's going to look like, but I think this is very much a case of early adopters. I think that's the case with Google Glass, probably less so with Jawbone or Nike Plus. But I think we're going to see rapid improvement, there's a lot of very big companies investing a lot of R&D to figure it out. Certainly Google's on there. Microsoft, I've always been impressed with their home of the future. I think the first time I went through there, it was on a tour from Kathy Maybe from SIC. But the R&D that these companies are making is, I think, just it's so impressive, and the willingness to fail fast and keep iterating and improving is it's really impressive. And I think for any company, there's a ton to learn from a Google or a Microsoft or Amazon as another company that's I think is very, very impressive.
What do you think about brands in the publishing space?
I was in a meeting with YouTube down at CES last year, and the head of sales at YouTube made the comment that not everybody can be Nike or Red Bull, and he advises not to even try. And as we talked more about it, it's in some ways an obvious comment, but you've got to know your brand and what you have a right to say. What are people going to actually care about? For somebody like Red Bull, they've done a great job of nailing kind of the adventure sports category, and I think filled a void there to some degree, where there was an audience that wanted more of that, and so they've done a great job. Nike the same, but if you're selling diapers, know your role, right? I mean, you can
didn't
talk
like that Prince George ad?
Yeah, you can talk about parenting, but try not to go far beyond that. So I think it's an interesting time in that brands I think are doing some self-reflection on what new kind of role they can play with their customers. And when it comes to developing content, that's a fairly new area for most brands.
Who do you think's doing it well besides Nike and Red Bull?
Let's see. I think in the automotive category, Lexus has done a nice job of becoming a bit of a lifestyle publisher, and they're a brand that did it in print for many years, and then brought some of that lifestyle publishing to digital. So I think their success is a good example of somebody who's tested what works and what they can publish and find a receptive audience. They've done it over time, and I think the fact that they're successful today is a reflection of that experience.
What can I tell you about the journalism world?
What can you tell me? Well, I would. It's not necessarily Time's world, but what do you think about local publishing? Because that's an area that has been. Everybody's expected there to be a level of disruption that we saw with metropolitan newspapers and to maybe a lesser degree magazines. But it doesn't feel like it's quite hit yet. AOL has made a lot of investments with Patch, and I like what Tim and company are doing. I like the strategy, but it hasn't quite hit the marks yet. And as I said, coming from a small local newspaper family, I'm always interested in hearing from people in the publishing industry what they think about local.
I think there's a place for it. I'm not sure how big that place is. That said, people want to know what affects them. When you're reading the news, you're looking for, is this going to impact my commute? Is this going to change my taxes? Is this going to affect my life in some way, shape, or form?
Yep.
And so I think that in that way, local news is very important. If it's telling you about your day-to-day life, it's very important. But I think we certainly have seen some very interesting publishing experiments that I'm not sure have the business model to back them up.
Yeah.
But I think that there will always be local news, and something that I think is really interesting is what New York Magazine has done. I wouldn't consider them really local because they're a national magazine, but what I would say is that they've made a really interesting branding choice in having New York Magazine be New York and then have their entertainment coverage be Vulture and their food coverage be Grub Street. I think that that was an active decision in making sure that people all over the world knew that reading New York Magazine's entertainment coverage did not mean that you were reading only about New York.
Yeah.
And I think that that's something we'll probably see a lot more of. Over the weekend, I read that Atlantic Media just named Atlantic Wire The Wire, so it's no longer going to be affiliated with The Atlantic, other than being under the parent company's umbrella. And I think that that is something really interesting. Again, these are not the hyper-local that you're talking about, but they're interesting branding experiments in that separating out from your quote-unquote parent company probably used to be a risk from a branding perspective. Nowadays, it's a gift because you can get a lot more ad dollars from companies that just want to advertise with a subset of people who are a business audience or a defense and government audience. And I think that's really interesting.
Yeah. I right about the time when Google went public, my father was the president of a company called Eagle Newspapers, which is 20-something small-town dailies and weeklies. And so I went to one of the board meetings and did 3 hours on why you needed to care about Google. And
did they look at you like you were crazy, or they believed you?
Well, I looked across the room, and it was a bunch of 60-ish publishers that were nearing retirement, and the looks on their eyes were, I know this is important. I don't think I have the appetite to change like this. And And for the most part, they didn't. They didn't change. And then I had a similar presentation for them when Facebook went public.
That one didn't go so well either.
No. They were, then 65 and not 60, and really didn't want to change. But they've been okay. They've as I referenced, they've been more insulated than metropolitan dailies, and they're getting there. They moved from trying to block Google from indexing their site to actually allowing it.
How long did it take for that battle to be lost?
Too long. Yeah. I think it was a couple of years. So.
Something I think is really interesting that you're touching on is this idea of old versus new, and something that I have so loved in my time at Time.
When you say old versus new, it's not you and I, right?
No,
okay. I
do not mean that at all. I'm 50 years old at heart. I don't know how old you are, but I consider myself to be the older person here. So something that I think is so interesting is that I think that the news organizations of the future and the ones that will survive are the ones that combine this old and new media, and the ones that have the journalistic standards that we grew up reading newspapers of, and the new digital disruption and innovation. One of the best things about being at Time has been this reverse mentorship experience that I've had, where people will come to me and say, teach me everything you know, and I'll say to them, teach me everything you know. It's so exciting to get to work with people who have seen so much that I can learn from. And I think, I do a lot of panels and things on millennials, and everyone says, oh, they're so entitled. And I think certainly there probably is some of that, but I think that the great media organizations of the future in advertising and publishing are going to be ones where both sides of the aisle come together and say, how do we make this work? And I've certainly seen that at Time.
Yeah, and I think one of the things I've noticed working with a lot of publishers is their willingness to allow their readers or their viewers to contribute, and not necessarily in a free-for-all sense, but in more of a kind of a curated way. You mentioned Medium, which I think is doing some really interesting stuff on that front. The Huffington Post has a wide range of guest columnists that I think has really been effective, and I think you'll see more and more of that, where there's just a shift in the mentality about how content is produced. It's not to say that your readers will replace your editorial staff, but they have a role to play. And I think that's a good example in a new perspective that publishers are taking between kind of the new and old way of thinking about the world.
I completely agree. I love the fact that the barrier to entry for media has never been lower.
Yeah.
I love that people can participate via their smartphone, via Twitter, via any medium nowadays, and report back and be in conversation with a news organization. I am really interested in a lot of these different media experiments that are looking at verification of on-the-ground or local or citizen reports, just because I think absolutely, media organizations are not going to have people on the ground in Wichita, Kansas when something happens and we need people on the scene. And I think that that's something that is incredibly interesting. And I also really believe in this idea of transparency. I think that everyone just wants access to what other people are doing. And one of the great things about the internet, and I often preach this idea of authenticity on the internet and really being who you are, putting yourself out there. And I think one of the best things that news organizations can do, and we certainly do this at Time, is give you the behind-the-scenes look, or the here's what went into making our cover. I'll think about in the magazine we had an issue that was why Texas is the future of America, and we had this little blurb on how the artist made this incredible piece of art that was our cover art, making the United States and every single state fit into the shape of Texas. And I love that. Anything where I can be a part of the process, I think is so cool. And I mean, you saw this back in the days of MTV and making the video and things like that.
Yeah. I
really believe that people want to be involved a lot more than most people would probably expect. I think everybody likes things that have to do with themselves, so getting involved, whether it's through UGC or through reading about or having access to their favorite people, is something that's so exciting. I mean, I think about, there was this fantastic Jay-Z, when Jay-Z came on Twitter one day to promote his new album, and he was tweeting randomly at some people. I just love this idea that like you can put something out there into the world and there's a chance that Jay-Z will write back. Like, that's so awesome, and it levels the playing field in a way that we've never seen before in publishing. Something that happened in response to that did not get enough credit, and I really want to give it credit now, is that Jay-Z tweeted that Cap'n Crunch was his favorite cereal. Somebody said, "What's your favorite cereal?" Cap'n Crunch. And Cap'n Crunch, whoever is behind this tweet, please contact me so I can like give you a hug or something, because they responded and said, "We got 99 problems, but Jay-Z ain't one." And like, it was just so good. And it didn't make the like splash that Oreo did, but I need that person to get a raise or something, because it was so funny.
Yeah. One of my favorite uses of Twitter from a brand was when AOL had Phil Jackson start to tweet, and he had all these misspellings, and then later tweeted out a picture of it's tough to type with all these rings on my fingers.
That was amazing.
Yeah.
I think it's really interesting to see how brands, publishers, people can really make moments of things like that. We had a funny internal moment recently at Time where, in response to the shutdown, we noticed that the Panda Cam was going to be down. And we were all sitting in an editorial board meeting that morning, and Bobby Ghosh, who's our international managing editor, said, "Well, we should make our own." And everyone was kind of like, yeah. And he was like, "No, I'm serious." And 2 hours later, we'd gone down to like the Hallmark store in the concourse and bought a plush panda. And for 16 days, we had a live stream camera on this panda.
Yeah.
And we let it go, and people loved it. And it was something that was really became very conversational on Twitter and on social media, where every day the panda was doing something different. I mean, one day it was getting an in-style makeover. The next day it was reading a book. I mean, this panda was up to all sorts of crazy things. And it soon became like a zoo with all these other plush animals around it. But it was something that we had a really great social media moment from that, and I think it's also a really good example of the behind-the-scenes story, where we were able to say, like, this is how this came about, and this is really fun, and this is what we do at Time.
Yeah.
In addition to putting out great journalism, we have panda cams.
Yeah.
And I just think,
it sounds like the panda arguably has a more interesting life than I do.
Yes,
Yeah.
totally. You'll have to come by. I mean, in-style makeover for you, too.
Yeah. No, but I do think there's, when you look at publishing today, there is something about showing the personality of a publishing brand through things like the Panda Cam, or even for a brand like Cap'n Crunch to be able to share some good humor and just make it feel like there's a little more personality to a brand or to a publisher has great value. And I think you also bring up a great point on the transparency angle. Digital channels have a way of learning what's real,
Mm-hmm.
and if you try to fight that, probably at your own peril, I would say.
Definitely. And I think it's really interesting, because I think Twitter's biggest challenge is going to be explaining itself to the global world, that it's not, walking down the street, eating a PB&J, that it's not just shorter Facebook status updates, which I actually thought it was. When I looked back through my Twitter archive, it's so embarrassing. I mean, it's like biking to class. I mean, I was convinced that this was where you put things that people your Facebook following wouldn't care about. That was where Twitter came in.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I just think oftentimes people ask me why they should get on Twitter and who they should follow, and I always urge them to follow people who are personalities and who have a presence that goes beyond just RSS feed type personas. I mean, our Time Twitter feed has over 5 million followers, and I think it's because we have such a conversational style, and it's something that has become really fun to follow and to engage with. And I mean, those are my favorite brands on Twitter, and I really love being surprised by those moments.
Yeah.
Something, I recently read and interviewed Alexis Ohanian, who's the founder of Reddit, for his book, Without Their Permission, which is all about creating startups in this world. And he talks about how all links are created equal on the web, and I thought that was a really interesting point. I was wondering if you could sort of expand on your thoughts on the idea of quality rising to the top. I mean, that's something I'm very committed to, obviously, working at Time, but how do you see it from an advertising perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think, there are a couple different things at play. We've seen the democratization of content on one hand, so it's easier than ever to create and distribute content, and that's left us with massive amounts of content. And I think now you're finding, you reference the ability to target a very specific subset of an audience or of a publisher, and I think that's the future of advertising, where you're going to see more and more specific targeted campaigns, which I think will have a couple of different effects. One is you will have very small publications that can make a really good business because their specific audience that they build will be valued. I think it will be harder for large publishers to exist if they don't have good targeting that allows brands to reach subsets of those big audiences. And so I think that the large publishers will be more reliant on technology. It is probably less certain that the smaller publishers will. It might be the case, but if it's truly a niche publication, the need to identify subsets of that already small audience might not be worth doing.
I think it's really interesting that you say that because it reminds me of the fact that publishing is no longer the last step in anyone's process, whether you're a brand or a media news organization. My job before working at Time was at Vox Media, which publishes SB Nation, The Verge, and Polygon, and I was the director of marketing communications there. And people always say, "Oh, you're not a journalist." And I said, "Actually, yes, I am, and all journalists need to be good marketers nowadays." And that's exactly what I was doing. I was figuring out, how do you hack the audiences of our content? How do you figure out the subset of people who need to see this? I think often about this major feature that The Verge did on a woman who was a facial transplant recipient, and she was actually on the front page of the New York Times on Sunday. And we thought, okay, so this is the story. It can live on its own. It can live on social media. It can live on theverge.com. Where else can it live? And the reality was this woman was a victim of domestic violence. She was she was part of a larger story that related to so many different audiences that needed to hear this. I mean, it's a wonderful, incredibly uplifting piece about how she's put her life back together and music's role in it and, making friends and having a relationship. And it was a story that truly benefited from us having reached out to so many different organizations. And I think that anytime you can break a story down in that way, it's just going to have such a bigger impact. I'm not even talking about traffic here or anything like that. Like, I got into journalism because I believed that it was a public service to bring people quality news and to make sure that people knew everything that they could about the world in which we live. And I just believe that so much more important than traffic and page views is nowadays engagement and time on site and the time people are spending with stories and the experience that they're having. And that can be from serious stories to fluff and more fun stories like, Britney Spears and Somali pirates. But I really believe in that. And I think the same is probably true in advertising. I mean, you can still have a wonderful advertising experience. I mean, people are always talking about different campaigns, the Dove ads. They're there are so many ad campaigns that spark conversation, and I think people probably don't give the advertising world that credit.
Yeah, I think that's true, though. I would say that there's been a lot of crap advertising online.
Also true?
Yeah, and I think that it is time for better quality advertising as well as content. If you look historically at print or at television, there is a tacit agreement between a reader and an advertiser and a publisher about advertising being on their TV or in their magazine in exchange for it being free or discounted to some degree. And in digital, I don't know that there is that same assumption that advertising is necessary because it hasn't been consistently high quality. And I think as the quality improves and a reader or a viewer are more thoughtful about the role that advertising plays in bringing them free or close to free content, that will be a big win. But I don't think we're quite there yet. If you look at just the proliferation of ad blockers, it would tell you that not everybody's quite on board with that agreement.
What do you think is going to be the most exciting part of media in the next few years, just to watch? I
don't know if I would use the term exciting, but I'm very interested in seeing what kind of legs the whole native advertising push has, because that potentially changes a lot about the publishing industry, and it back to our earlier points about the role that brands can play as publishers. This allows them to do that, but also puts them in the middle of a website potentially. I was reading this morning that the New York Times is expecting to make a big push in native advertising, which that is one of the sort of the voices of the country, and so for them to be making the push is really interesting. So I think as a business case to study, I think that's going to be pretty fascinating, at least for people in our business, maybe not to the masses.
I think how much people hate advertising is sort of like one of those get off my lawn conversations.
Yeah.
It reminds me so much of this, like, the millennials are entitled thing. I think that people understand advertising has a purpose and that it needs to exist. And the times in which they do not like it is when it is invasive and or misleading.
Yep.
And so I wonder if that part of the native advertising conversation is also going to be a big thing, because I think that the risk you run with native advertising is some organizations now have journalists covering beats who are also writing their native advertising content. And I think that is something we would never do at Time. And I just wonder how things will shake out and how much the public really does care or notice. Obviously, that's something that's very concerning.
Yeah.
But I think we oftentimes live in this media bubble that, like you said, maybe people outside our industry don't really care about this.
Yeah.
I don't know. Something that's also really interesting to me is the fact that we always hear about the death of print, the death of TV, the death of this, the death of that. Other industries have been disrupted before, and it doesn't seem to me that the screams of death have been as loud. What do you think?
Yeah, I do think that death is a strong word in most cases, but I think the risk is that it's not the death of business models; it's that it's less profitable models. I think a great example of that is in the newspaper business. Classified advertising essentially disappearing makes them much less profitable businesses. So there was disruption to what they do that classifieds drove a lot of revenue for most metropolitan dailies, and digital caused that to go away.
We're also seeing something very interesting in the events business. The New York Times had a front page of business section story on Monday about all of the news organizations getting into the events business.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
From what I understand, it turns out to be a pretty profitable business. I think about it like recording artists that allow their music to be free or discounted, and they make their money when they go on tour or concerts and through selling T-shirts and other items. And I think about the events business in the same way, that even if your advertising business on your property or publication is not as profitable as maybe it once was, there's new revenue that you can get through events. And I think when it's a trusted brand, whether it's a New York Times or a Fast Company, there's real credibility there, and people want to be associated with those brands, and they want to be featured on a stage or as a sponsor or whatever the case might be. So I think it's a healthy thing, and it's allowing businesses to be bolstered a bit at a time when they need it.
Yeah, I'm really excited about it. I think it's something that presents so many interesting discussions, which I think oftentimes, I love events like this and conferences and things like that, because I think that oftentimes they bring backroom conversations to the front of the stage, and I think that that's something that people want a lot more of. I love the idea of going and sitting in a room with 200 people and hearing what, Joel Stein of Time or Joe Klein of Time has to say. And I think that that is something that has so much potential, and it goes back to this idea, again, of people getting to know the humans behind the brand. I think that, it's really interesting to me, some publications don't use bylines, and I just think that's so, fascinating, because for me, I love following specific writers or personalities or reporters or people who I feel like I'm a part of their experience or their journey or something.
Yeah.
And I think that's really interesting, and I think that the web has made it so that on a platform like Medium, you could start following someone who is a writer or something that you never would have known about. This idea of discoverability. It sort of goes back to this idea of YouTube and the democratization of being famous. Think about reality TV and shows like American Idol. You could be at home one day singing in the shower, and the next day you're Kelly Clarkson. I think that this participatory ability and the fact that now everyone can create their own media is so much fun. I just think about how many Vines we see or selfies from Snapchats or things that get preserved and become sort of these iconic moments. New York or Brooklyn has this Halloween party every year, and my friend was asking me, what are the best memes, and to see all the photos and what people dressed up as, and so many things that were sort of media memes and had come out of this national conversation. I just think it's so great.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's, as we were saying earlier, this, the ability to create and distribute content has been fantastic for people, because it brings a voice to people that have something to say, whether it's smart or interesting or funny or whatever the case might be. I think it's a very healthy trend.
What do you think people's appetite is for video?
In what sense?
I have a DVD player. That is so weird.
Yeah.
I still get my Netflix on DVDs. There's something about the experience that I just love so much, of like putting in the DVD, watching it on television, taking out the DVD, putting it back, and being done with it.
Yeah.
How do you think, how hungry do you think people are for video content on every screen, and how interested do you think they are in sharing it?
I think the demand for video on any screen is high and growing. I think that is the future. I'm a big believer in video anywhere. And I do think that you're a dinosaur for wanting DVDs.
I said I was 50 at heart.
There was news this week that Netflix is expected to explore feature films streaming, and we'll see if it works. But it's undeniable that Orange is the New Black or Breaking Bad and the impact that Netflix had on the way that ratings grew for Breaking Bad in the last season. I think it's clear that there's big business there, and the head of marketing for North America is a former Seattleite, now down in the Bay Area, and I've talked with him a number of times since he started, and I've been so impressed with what they're doing and the attitude that pervades Netflix specifically around this idea of video on any screen. So I think for content, that is the future, and then I think along with that, advertising on any screen for video is the future. The nice thing about video advertising for publishers is there typically is finite inventory, and so when supply is compressed in some way, and demand is high because brands love sight, sound, and motion, you end up with much higher costs for video, and so I think that that'll be a very healthy part of the industry.
I totally agree, and despite owning a DVD player, I love video when it is personality driven. I'm actually going to be hosting my own show at Time called The Top 3, which is 3 things you need to know each day based on what people are talking about. And I love the explainers and things that we've really delved into where a personality or someone you recognize can tell you the news in human terms. I think video is really the easiest medium through which to get across the main point and to explain things in conversational language in a way that oftentimes text does not.
Yeah.
I think, I remember when I was in middle school, my parents gave me USA Today to start reading as like a primer to the New York Times, like the idea that like you have to build up to reading the New York Times. The web has made it so that things are so much easier to understand because we're talking like humans. And I think that video is the greatest example of that. I mean, we've doubled our team at Time on video and are making a full investment there in original content and programming to, bring our readers into the process and have them get to know us as well.
Yeah. I mean, you're even, you're hearing from Google in the past week that even for just static display ads, that they're exploring or considering having their network of publishers decrease the number of ad units on a page. And I think it very much follows that video model where if you can decrease supply a bit, you might see a rise in rates, and that's something that benefits a lot of publishers.
Totally. And I can't help but think in you saying Breaking Bad, yesterday Aaron Paul Instagrammed this amazing series of 4 pictures of Bryan Cranston in this like bright pink sweater holding like the pink fuzzy horse or unicorn or whatever that is.
I saw your tweet about it.
Oh.
That was, yeah.
Okay, well then we don't need to talk about it. I mean, but I think that idea, again, it goes back to this idea of media moments and the moment you can create something around content from the past. I mean, I'm so fascinated as well by Netflix's approach to algorithms and how they reverse engineered House of Cards based on what people were interested in. They saw Kevin Spacey, strong lead, people like his movies, politics, dark, deep undertones. I think that's so interesting, and I wonder if that same kind of reverse engineering at some point is going to enter news. I think it probably already has in a lot of ways with people like lists, people like this, people like that, and how do we put all those things together? I remember, I think there was some story that was like Justin Bieber and Kim Kardashian, and someone tweeted like, man, SEO gold. Like, it's just like combining those two forces of what people want.
Yeah, well, and that might be an example of the dark side of publishing, if that's what people want.
So I want to make sure I ask you before we run out of time. I have no idea how long we have left. We could just sit here all day talking.
Yeah.
But how do you get your news?
10.
We have 10 minutes left. Are we supposed to take questions?
I'm happy to.
We can take questions. Okay. Tell me how you get your news, and then let's take questions.
So I do still get multiple newspapers.
I knew I liked you.
Yeah, and I get multiple magazines. Not, what you said, 14 for you? Yeah, no, I don't get that many. But it's mostly digital. But I've read a newspaper before I left the house every day since I was in about the 4th grade. So that's a hard habit to break, a long-standing habit to break. But it is digital and increasingly mobile.
What's the first news source you check in the morning?
Usually Twitter. Yeah. I've got a good list of publications and journalists that I follow, and
me,
like you, yeah, perfect example. And so it that's kind of replaced RSS feeds for me.
Cool. Do we have questions? Yeah.
I've heard the term quality content float around a lot over the past few days, and I work for a CPG company, and I'm just wondering if you guys have an example of a CPG company that provides quality content? And CPG, consumer packaged goods.
Yeah. Callie brought up what Dove has done, and I really like that example because it shows a brand that has compassion and emotion, and it felt like they had the right to do the videos that they did, and it's been talked about a lot and held up as an example, but I think for good reason, because it seemed like a very natural fit.
I'd also add Unilever's involvement in the Makers series and the women who've made history and what it is today. I thought that their integration was very organic and felt very, it fit.
The other example, it's not a CPG, but I think is really interesting is Mercedes, as they've tried to reach a younger target audience, hired a filmmaker in New York named Casey Neistat, and Casey's built up a following. He got a ticket riding his bike. He was actually in the bike lane in New York, but still got a ticket, and so he did this quite funny video about sort of the rules for bikes in New York City, and got featured on the New York Times, and so he built up a real following, and he's very active on YouTube and Twitter, and but still a little bit under the radar. He had a show on HBO with his brother for a couple years, but just a really interesting, quirky guy. And Mercedes hired him to do these videos for the launch of the CLA, I think is the model. And they gave him a budget and free reign to do whatever he wanted. And there's, I think, a lot of people that think that his videos that he created are much more effective and interesting than their much higher budget TV spots. He did a similar one for Nike, I think it was for Nike Plus, where they gave him a budget and no other direction, no creative brief, no anything. And he took a friend and traveled around the world and filmed himself. Yeah, and it's just, it's I think a good example of a brand giving, free rein to an artist. And, in both those cases, the outcome was great. Yep.
Now, what do you think of Forrester's finding that Facebook has no value in paid AdSense?
I think it's a little hyperbolic. Yeah, I think that, as I was saying earlier, that I think it's an indication that it's still very early days for ad models in social networks. But I think it would be silly to say that there's no future. The audience for Facebook is so large that I think they'll get it right. And the fact is they have a lot of revenue today. So to call it a failure, I think is a little over the top.
I'm also interested to see what they do with video in the newsfeed and how invasive that feels, if so. There's been a lot of talk about them putting video in the near future, and I think it might be autoplay, which I do not think would go over well with consumers, but I'm interested to see how that experiment comes out. Yeah?
So Callie, a few questions about the role of magazine plays for you all moving forward. Because if I think about the magazines I still get in the news space are the ones that are not so much news, but more about maybe context and kind of make sense of the stuff I get online. And I think about Time as a magazine is almost, that's what that used to play, is the kind of more timely Time as a brand. And so as you think about the magazine and everything you're doing, how do you guys think about that?
The magazine is absolutely critical to everything we do. I think Time's strength has always been in the primers, the analysis, and the postscript, making sense of what you need to know. I mean, going back to Henry Luce's mission statement for Time, he said that a busy man, I would say person, but a busy man should be able to read Time in an hour and understand everything he needs to know about the world, and I think that's absolutely still our mission and something that we uphold every week. Yes?
This is a question for Jeff. I was wondering if you could give some specific suggestions for smaller publishers who have, let's say, visitors in the single-digit millions a month online on how to monetize their content.
One of the things that I think can be effective if you can find the right people is to pull together an advisory team from the marketing community or from agencies. Because if you find the right people, it allows you to get a look inside of how they spend their money and how they distribute marketing budget in a way that's hard to do if you're just, smiling and dialing. So I think that can be effective. Outside of that, the other thing that I think is very useful is to really understand your audience. As I mentioned before, I think there is going to be growing demand for very specific audiences, either a subset of a big brand or a specific audience around a publisher. And so it's just about knowing your audience and being able to identify why they're unique relative to other options in the market. But if you can get a handful of good advisors, that allows you to get closer to budgets, which is what you're after, than most other methods.
I think we have time for 2 more questions. Yes?
This is for Jeff. So I know you just joined Mixpo, which is a video platform. But what are your thoughts on, user-initiated video versus pre-roll or mid-roll as a kind of vehicle to distribute branded content?
Yeah, so I think one of the lessons from Hulu is that they gave users a choice, and that seemed to work for them. I listened to Jason Kyler, the former CEO, give a talk a couple of weeks ago, and that was, I think, pretty critical for the way they built their advertising business, and I think is a good lesson to learn for other publishers around user choice. So I don't know that I would say that in-stream or in-banner or pre or mid is the best. I would say listen to your viewers and give them that choice.
I think you make users feel so much more important and cared about if you give them the choice. A lot of people have recently been talking about those in-article surveys where I guess you fill out some answer and it goes away or something. I think that as long as the reader feels that they're not forced to do something or that they have an option somewhere, they feel so much better about your content. And in terms of brand loyalty, the greatest thing you can do is have people feel good about your content. Last question? Yes.
I'm going to ask you a question. Callie,
Yes.
to repeat this, you talk about how New York Magazine, you cite New York Magazine as an example of success in branding Vulture and The Cut. Some of those brands, Grub Street, were already brands on their own that they acquired, and so they were able to leverage the kind of the audience they already had. Publishers like Time, where it's a 90-year-old brand, it has this cachet, it has this deep respect and is renowned. What do you think, what's the danger? I mean, what's the flip side of trying to create a new brand? You know, they're not all success stories.
Certainly.
What do you think what cautionary tales do people have to, or what cautions should they take?
I think that's a really good question. I think that with New York Magazine, because it has the New York tie, it had the danger of, New York food or New York, fashion or something like that. It would have been a much trickier road for them, but with a brand like Time that has the iconic brand recognition everywhere, if it's Time Business or Time, Arts and Entertainment, or Jim Poniwazik writing for Time about Breaking Bad, the greatest thing you can do is leverage the personalities and their tie to the brand. So in that sense, absolutely keeping the tie to the iconic legacy. I mean, I think the same is probably true of the New York Times and places that have real brand recognition in history.
Well, I think you can also look at what ESPN did with Bill Simmons with Grantland, where they, allowed a new brand to be created, and now more recently with Sports Illustrated and Peter King, their lead football writer, with Monday Morning Quarterback. In both cases, they've allowed brands to be created, and really didn't leverage the umbrella brand much at all in either case.
Is that it? Thank you.
All right, thanks everybody.